So a big ruling from the Court of Appeal means that Paula Vanessa Llewelyn is still Jamaica's Director of Public Prosecutions. Look, it's a big victory for her. It's a big victory for the government. I'm Dionne Jackson Miller. Thanks so much for joining me courtside. What happened? What happens now? Stay tuned. Now, this ruling from the Court of Appeal came on the very last day of the court term, but I pretty much think that for Paula Vanessa, it's a ruling that was well worth waiting for, because what happens now is that she gets to return triumphantly to office as the DPP, and she gets to stay until age 65, that's in September 2025, when she reaches the new retirement age. And that must be a big deal, you know. It's also a big deal for the government because they've lost some big constitutional cases. Think NIDS, for example, or state of emergency, or undated Senate resignation letters. So yeah, they have to be celebrating this as well. Christmas come early for them too. Somebody said to me that this seems like a lot of work and effort for what might be a very small payoff, meaning Miss Llewelyn at this point has less than a year in office before she retires. But I think the really big thing is that she gets to leave on her own terms, you know. Historic achievement, first woman to be DPP, and now the DPP who fought through a constitutional challenge and won. So she leaves on her own terms. She leaves without the court kicking her out, which is what it had looked like after the Supreme Court had made that ruling. So that has to be a big deal. That has to count for a lot. So what happened here? So I'm doing this video as a quick summary, right? When I go through the actual written judgment, then I'll be in a better position to do a deep dive into it. I'm probably going to need a whole heap of very strong tea for that, or something stronger, because I'm expecting that judgment to be very long and very involved, you know. But make we go first with the essentials of what happened. So first I have to remind you of the facts so you can understand what the Court of Appeal has said here. So Miss Llewelyn was due to retire on her 60th birthday in September 2020. In January that year, she wrote to the Public Services Commission that appoints public servants and said, look, I want some more time. Prime Minister Andrew Holness then wrote to the leader of the opposition, who was at the time Peter Phillips, and said, boy, I we give her 5 more years. Dr. Phillips said, no, sir. I don't think she deserved that. He said he didn't think she had accomplished enough to warrant that extension. I have to say, I think that's one of the really unfortunate things about this case, because that kind of correspondence is really supposed to be entirely confidential. People are supposed to be able to speak their mind and say whatever they think about the people that they're being asked about without thinking it's going to end up on the front page of the Gleaner or all over social media. Anyway, be that as it may, the Prime Minister recommended a 3-year extension instead of the 5-year extension. And let me just say another thing, which is that arguably, if the leader of the opposition is so set against a particular appointment, maybe it's something the Prime Minister shouldn't do at all, because really and truly, holders of offices as important as this, you really want a situation that both the leader of the opposition and the Prime Minister have agreed that this person should be there. Not talking specifically about Miss Llewelyn and the current situation. I am making a general point. That does, though, raise a whole question about the whole idea of consultation, as the Constitution says, what that means and what really should be the outcome of that, and that could be a whole video on its own, and the court did speak about that. We'll come to that in a little bit. But arguably, we did see that the consultation had some effect, because instead of the initial 5 years, the Prime Minister recommended 3. But in February 2023, that was the year the 3-year extension was going to retire, Miss Llewelyn asked for another extension. At that point, the Public Services Commission said no. They said the Constitution says you only get 1 extension. You got it already, argument done. On top of that, they said the Prime Minister actually took legal advice on this, and they said no, you can't get a more extension. But then in July, the government passed a law amending the Constitution, and this did 2 things. 1, it raised the retirement age of the Director of Public Prosecutions and the Auditor General from 60 to 65 years. It also said that the person who is DPP when the law comes into effect, in other words, Miss Llewelyn, could elect or choose to retire at any time after the age of 60. This was one of the most controversial aspects of the law because of the wording that it said she could choose to retire at any time over the age of 60. That sounded as if she could stay basically as long as she wanted. Now, the government took the bill to Parliament. It was tabled, debated, and passed in the House of Representatives all on one day. That was on July 25, 2023. Then it was passed in the Senate a few days after that, and then the Governor General signed it into law. Now, the government says in all of this, they were just pushing through a process to ensure that the DPP and the Auditor General had a retirement age of 65, which was in line with everybody else in the public sector. So in August, the DPP wrote to the Public Services Commission and said, hey, my retirement age is now 65, not leaving in September, I'm staying until 65. So why was this a big deal? A couple of things. A lot of people are upset about the process, the way it happened. There was a Constitutional Reform Committee actually meeting at the time. Why not ask them to look at this issue, since it was an issue of amending the Constitution? So it really and truly is very unusual, if not unprecedented, to see a bill to amend the Constitution pushed through in this kind of way. Really and truly, to amend the Constitution, you want those bills to, you want the public to know what they say. You want to give people time for discussion, to disagree if they want to. I'd interviewed Justice Minister Delroy Chuck and I asked him about that, and his position was, look, we've been talking about this for a while. Everybody know what we want to do. We know what they must say already. We know who disagrees, and we're going to do it anyway. So that was his position. And if you're wondering how come nobody's talking about the Auditor General, that's because she really doesn't figure into the issue, because she hadn't reached retirement age yet. She hasn't reached 60 yet. There was no extension. So all the attention, therefore, was on the DPP and what was happening with that office. So the opposition took the issue to court. And the names you're going to see on the judgment are Philip Paulwell, because he's leader of opposition business in the House of Representatives. And then Peter Bunting is the leader of opposition business in the Senate. And that's because when you take a case to court, the court is going to want to know if you have what they call standing. Do you have some kind of connection with the matter that qualifies you to go to the court and ask them to deal with this issue? And clearly, both Bunting and Paulwell have standing because of their jobs in Parliament. Now, the Supreme Court had ruled that the part of the Act that raised the retirement age for the DPP and the Auditor General was fine. They said that can't stay. But they said the part that allowed Miss Llewelyn to choose to retire at any time after the age of 60, they said that wasn't okay. And then what happened now is that because the Supreme Court made that ruling in April, Miss Llewelyn couldn't continue in office as a DPP, because the effect of the Supreme Court's ruling was to say that her time in office had ended in September 2023 when the 3-year extension ended. So she has been on leave, and we've had an acting DPP since this ruling came out. Since the Supreme Court ruling came out, I should say. So the government came out strong right from the get-go, right from the Supreme Court made its ruling and said, we don't agree with this, we think it's wrong, and they appealed. And they won. So here's a summary of what the Court of Appeal decided. So they looked at whether Section 2(1) of the law that amended the Constitution breached substantive principles of constitutional law. What does that mean? Very briefly, the opposition had been arguing a number of things. They had argued that Section 2(1), that's the section that raised the retirement age of the Auditor General and the DPP, they said it breached some constitutional principles. They said the law was passed for the improper purpose of giving Miss Llewelyn extra time as DPP. They also were saying that it breached the constitutional principle of separation of powers. Separation of powers is a principle that basically says the different arms of government, legislature, that's Parliament in this case, and the executive, they shouldn't interfere with what the other person is doing more than so, right? So in this particular case, there's a process for extending the tenure of the DPP that the executive deals with, meaning the Prime Minister consults with the leader of the opposition and makes a recommendation to the Governor General. The opposition was arguing that what was happening in this case is that Parliament was interfering with that process by passing this law to raise the retirement age, and therefore using that as a way to give Miss Llewelyn the extension that she couldn't otherwise have got. So that's what the opposition was arguing. The Supreme Court had disagreed with those arguments, and they said, no, that part of the law is okay. The Court of Appeal agreed with that as well. What the court said is that the law was passed for a proper purpose. They said the proper purpose was to raise the retirement age of the DPP and Auditor General to bring them into line with the rest of the public sector. Then they looked at the question as to whether the Supreme Court made a mistake in ruling that Section 2.1 didn't circumvent, undermine, or contradict the constitutionally mandated process for extending the term of office of a DPP. In other words, was Parliament trying to go around the process that's set out in the Constitution to extend Ms. Llewelyn's tenure? And the courts, both the Supreme Court and the Court of Appeal here, said no. The Court of Appeal said, look, this wasn't an extension, it was a raising of the retirement age. And they said because Ms. Llewelyn was still DPP at the time, she benefited from the increased retirement age. So they're saying it was a raising of the retirement age, not a second extension to her tenure. And I should say that's the argument that the government had been making very strongly. Now, the big question that the two courts disagreed on, did Section 2.2, that's the section that said Ms. Llewelyn could elect to retire at any time over the age of 60. Was that a problem? Did that breach the Constitution? The Supreme Court said yes, it did breach the Constitution because it gave Ms. Llewelyn a right she did not have before. They said it left out the opposition leader out of the process, out of deciding if she should stay in office. Now, the Court of Appeal on this point said the Supreme Court was wrong. They said the Supreme Court used a wrong test to make its decision. The test that the Supreme Court used was to look at whether the new act was substantially different from what the drafters of the Constitution had intended, or whether the new act changed what the Constitution said about how an extension can be granted. But the Court of Appeal said no. They said the test that should be used is whether Parliament used the correct process to change the Constitution. They said Section 2.2, the section that says she can retire at any time after the age of 60, they said this is just a transitional provision to bridge the gap between a DPP who came in when the retirement age was 60 and saw it raised to 65, and what happens after that. They said that once the act was passed raising the retirement age, Ms. Llewelyn automatically benefited from that increase, and that the whole idea of her being allowed to retire at any time after 60, they say all that was about was just giving her the opportunity to take early retirement if she didn't want to wait all the way until 65. So they said the full court, that's the Constitutional Court, the Supreme Court, sitting with at least 3 judges, they said the full court made a mistake in declaring that Section 2.2 was invalid and that it be struck down as being unconstitutional, null, void, and of no legal effect. Then they looked at the question as to whether the Section 2.1, the section raising the retirement age, should be read down and construed as not applying to the DPP. In other words, should the court say, yes, the retirement age is raised from 60 to 65 by this act, but Paula, this not have nothing to do with you, all right? The Court of Appeal said, They said the act clearly captures the inclusion of the incumbent DPP, and if the courts were to say that the act didn't include Ms. Llewelyn, they would be interfering with what Parliament wanted to do. Just a quick note to say, yes, the courts can strike down laws passed by Parliament as being unconstitutional. The Court of Appeal here is saying the act is not unconstitutional, so we don't have any basis to strike it down. So if we strike it down, what we're doing there now is interfering with what Parliament wants to do without any legal basis. So the Constitution also says that the Prime Minister, as I've been saying to you, has to consult with the leader of the opposition before making a recommendation to the Governor General. Question is, does consultation mean agreement? The Supreme Court had said yes, but the Court of Appeal said no, consultation doesn't mean agreement, So basically, the Constitution says in a number of different situations that the Prime Minister should consult with the leader of the opposition. But really and truly, if the Prime Minister says to the leader of the opposition, boy, me want the so-and-so, and the leader of the opposition said, boy, me not think so that makes sense, the Prime Minister doesn't have to listen to that. He has already consulted. He can basically do what he wants to do. So what happens now? up to the time of this video, the opposition hadn't said what they're going to do, whether or not they're going to be appealing further. I would say I don't think an appeal would have any practical implication. I think Miss Llewelyn is going to reach retirement age of 65 before anything else can happen. You might argue though that there's a question of law as to whether or not what has happened here still needs to be pronounced on by our final court. We'll see what happens there. In the meantime though, Miss Llewelyn is getting ready to come back and take over the reins of her office. I'm sure that will happen probably early January 2025. And remember, she now retires at the age of 65, which is September 2025. So that's going to be about 9 months. So really and truly, I think most of that time is going to have to be spent in getting ready to leave. You know, preparing for the transition, preparing for whoever is going to be coming next, and tidying up those last things that she wants to leave as part of her legacy. I should say as well, I interviewed her after the Court of Appeal ruling came out, and one of the questions I was saying is a lot of people are saying, why were you fighting here? Isn't this a little bit undignified? Shouldn't you just have said, you know something, let me go do something else? And she was very strong on this. She said she believed that the Supreme Court was wrong. She believed she had the right to stay until 65, and she believed that that when you're right on a matter of principle, you should fight. So again, she's gonna get to leave on a triumphant note, and what a story she will have to tell. Thank you so much for watching. Like the video now, subscribe to the channel, share it if you think there's somebody who might be interested, and click that notification bell. That way you'll know whenever I have a new video out. I am Dionne. Thank you so much for joining me courtside. I'll see you next time.